It is now broadcast.
People are joining us live as we wait, trying to see when Chris joins in. I think he's once again having technical difficulties. Hello, everyone. Oh. Oh, he's here. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
Hi.
We're just gonna wait a little bit for some attendees to come in, but thank you for coming.
Sure. I'm just going to make sure that all of my settings are correct here. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. In the meantime, everyone can start checking code on the membership portal.
Check.
Please note the checking code is Googs, and I believe the O's are zeros.
Maybe it'll chat and everything. That's exciting. Okay, there you go. Check in Googs.
Yeah.
Oh wait, I had like your like a. Let me see. I seem to remember I had a background specifically for you.
Oh yeah. I remember.
See if I can find that. There it is.
So Chris, how's your day going so far?
It's a little exhausting, to be frank.
Yeah.
You know.
Everything online stuff.
So I've been. This has been like the week for speeches and stuff. I've done like. How many did I do? I did like a. Okay, hold on. Let me fade this over. Boop. So yeah. So I did like. This is my 4th speech of the week. And one of them was at like 7:15 in the morning, and I had to show up for the green room at like 4:30. And I'm like, oh, I mean, I know you college students love waking up early, but I'm older, man. You know, that stuff wears one down.
That's so
There
strange.
Yeah. So there you go. Now,
and
now
Zoom
the
gets
right
old.
background.
Now we're all home at UCSD.
Yeah. See, now you can feel like you're at UCSD, which is where all of
Isn't it
you
awesome?
are. Right. I mean, so did they have you all? You all are streaming, I'm assuming.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, that's exciting.
UCSD, they brought back around like half capacity for on-campus housing, and then like everyone else is basically at home or.
Yeah. Did they have any flare-ups of
On-campus.
COVID with the kids?
Not that I know of so far.
That's good, right?
Yeah.
Unless you really want to get COVID, which I don't think people do.
I'll pass for this time.
Yeah, no, it sounds like a real bad news.
All right, so before we get started, I'm just going to introduce ACM Innovate for those of you who aren't familiar. So ACM is the world's largest computing society, and the ACM chapter at UCSD is the largest engineering student organization on campus. ACM Innovate's mission is to inspire innovation and entrepreneurship at every level and to bring together like-minded individuals. For today's talk, we're delighted to be joined by Chris DiBona. Chris is the Director of Open Source and Science Outreach for Google. His team oversees license compliance and supports the open source developer community through programs such as the Google Summer of Code and through the release of open source software projects and patches. Additionally, he runs Google Making Science, an emerging scientific outreach program focused on the maker movement. We are lucky enough to have him talk with us about open source and his experiences with innovation through open source software. Throughout the talk, we'll be incorporating student questions as well, so feel free to send questions in the chat if you want us to ask. So I guess before we really dive in, the first thing I wanted to ask Chris to make sure that everyone's on the same page is, I guess, what is open source and why is it important for innovation?
So open source is very simply software with an open source license attached to it. People want to dress it up in a lot of different ways, but at its core, it's software that we've learned how to share with each other. And more importantly, so when I first got to Google in 2004, they asked me to cut an intellectual property joint developer agreement with Stanford. And so I was like, okay, I'm the open source guy, but I guess I can do this. And so I worked with the lawyer folks who were, everyone was really nice, and with the intellectual property transfer office um, over at Stanford, and everyone wanted the same thing. We wanted to figure out a way we could all work together. And I'm just like the whole time going, just use open source software, just slap a license on it, and let's all work together online, right? And it took about 11 months for us to sign a commercial joint development agreement. 11 months is a really long time. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
11 months is a whole school year. It's, I'm going to maybe live to 80 if I'm lucky, given my family history. So yeah, it's like 1/80th of my life was spent on that contract. Now, obviously it wasn't full time or the rest, but the thing about open source software is it gives us this really fertile middle place to work together. So you don't have to trust Google, you don't have to trust Stanford, you don't have to trust, your neighbor down the way. You can trust the license and know what that means and what it expects of you. So, open source software is just software with a license that is open source. And what are open source licenses, you say? Well, let me tell you. So all licenses are actually the same. All right. They have a list of things you're allowed to do and a list of things that you have to do if you want to do those allowed things. And then there's usually a warranty or a disclaimer of warranty saying that, hey, just because you have the software doesn't mean that I think that you're going to do a great job with it, right? So open source software licenses are just software licenses. So they say that you can use, modify, distribute, fold, spindle, mutilate this code in whatever way you see fit. And in return, you must do X, Y, or Z. And those X, Y, or Zs are very clear in open source. They say you have to acknowledge that you're using that software, or they say that you'll have to share some code too, or you'll have to share code that is linked to the code that you're sharing to. It depends on the license, but they all have sort of the same goal, which is here's some software. You can do with it whatever you want. If you end up shipping it to people outside of your university, company, organization, whatever, then you have to do a couple of things. And the permissive licenses all say you just have to acknowledge you're using it. And then the copyleft licenses or the share alike licenses, they have different versions, different ways that you have to share the work that you work on too. So like suppose you take a library that's under the LGPL, open source software license, and you incorporate it into your program, and then you ship that program to a customer or a friend, your mom, whatever it might be, someone outside of your organization. Then you would have to share that library's code that you were using, as well as any improvements you've made to that library. And that's it. Now, if you use the full GPL, you would also have to share the code that is linked to that library that incorporates that code. And if it was an Apache license, you don't have to share anything. You just have to say, you know what, I'm using this library. It's great. You don't even have to say it's great. You just have to say you're using the library. You have to give credit. So that's open source licensing sort of in a nutshell. And I know I'm really, glossing over a lot of the features of it, but the whole point of it is so that we can work together without worrying about one person, really doing untoward things with the software without our permission. So the other great thing about open source software is suppose I don't know, Stanley has a piece of software that I really, really want to use. And Stanley, he's great, but he's super into ARM and I'm really into RISC-V. Okay. It's just, we can agree to disagree. So I take Stanley's code, I re-implement it, I change the things that make it more RISC-V friendly, and I say, hey, Stanley, here's my here's my patches that make your library better so that it runs on RISC-V. And Sally goes, I don't want that. And I would say, okay, that's fine. I'm just going to fork the code and I'm going to go do it over here. And then a couple years pass and Stanley says, hey, actually RISC-V is kind of cool. Can I see that patch again? It's like, hey, I've been developing this thing over here for a while, but you know what? Let's bring them back together, right? So we merge them back together. They're still under the same open source license. So we can easily recombine them and we can still benefit from each other's work over the intervening years. So this process of forking is prevalent and it's actually extremely common. And it's one of the things that people don't realize is so wonderful about open source software. It gives us ways of experimenting and doing things with software that maybe the original authors weren't into, didn't anticipate, and we can see if it makes sense. And we don't have to have some long 11-month long discussion about what we do in the event that we don't agree on a certain direction for a while, and we can stay friends. So Stanley and I are still pals. So I don't know if that answers your question. I was yammering a lot. I apologize.
Yeah. So like even before Google, you were really heavily involved in the world of open source and through platforms like Slashdot.org and the
No
Philosophy
one's heard of
Podcast.
Slashdot in this class, man.
So could you tell us a little more about those?
Sure.
And then perhaps more importantly, like what first convinced you that you really wanted to get into open source software and like be an advocate for it?
So I was not a very good student. All of you are wonderful students compared to me. Okay. When I was y'all's age, and in my early 20s, I had gone, well, when I was in high school, I was a terrible student in high school. Nobody wanted to, I didn't even apply to most colleges. I applied to like one college and they were like, yeah, right. And they like threw it back in my face. And they were right to do so. I was bad. And so I went to the local community college and I got my associate's degree in computer science. And so my gut classes were all done at the community college. And then I went to George Mason. And I went to George Mason, and this was in the early 90s, mid 90s, like 94, 95. And the computer lab at George Mason was a bunch of Sun Spark stations running off of a centralized like Sun 10K server, right? And okay, computer programmers in the mid 90s in a claustrophobic room with 20 terminals and insufficient air conditioning, it was really hard, A, to get a terminal, and B, to stand the air while you're inside it. So I was like, I really need to figure out Unix at home. And BSD had already come out a long time ago. And so I was like, oh, okay, maybe I should get BSD. And so I was at the local micro center or something, and there was I think it was a Slackware distribution. It was 1995. And so I grabbed Slackware, which was an early Linux distribution. Not many people use it anymore. And I installed it on a somewhat older 46, 16 or 25 megahertz machine. And it was amazing. I have to tell you, it was absolutely fantastic. I was entering my operating systems class at George Mason, and they just wanted it was like a demonstrator program for doing interprocess communication over Berkeley sockets. And so I whipped it up in like no time at all on the Linux machine. I telnetted, or I think it was telnet actually, into the school systems, logged in, copied the program over, and tested it out remotely. And I was all inside my Linux machine. I was happy as a clam. The air conditioning was freaking perfect, and it didn't smell too bad. It just smelled like me, right? And I'm sure I smelled like flowers. And yeah, so I was able to do my homework, and I was able to learn a lot by looking at the source code of Linux, and it was pretty great. And so I went through another 2 years or so of university in Virginia. I was working for the State Department, and then I went to work for a law firm running their email network. And I had one class left in my bachelor's degree, and then I moved to California. So I wouldn't do that class for another 10 years. But we'll get to that later. Don't be like me. Be a good student. So I went to California, and I was really enjoying using Linux just at home, and every once in a while at work a little bit. But most people didn't know what it was. And And we had like SCO machines and a couple of Unix machines at the law firm for the email network. And so when I got to California and I was working for Tandem, which was a fault tolerant computer maker that was later sold to HP, the local Unix users group, PC Unix users group, met in Carl's Jr., which is Hardee's east of the Mississippi. And they would have burgers and talk about nerd stuff. Yeah, seriously, Sam, don't be like I was in school. That's a bad way to go. You want to graduate, right? I mean, because it took me a while. Anyway, so yeah, so I came out here and the local users group, I was like, but what about Linux? And they're like, we love Linux. And I'm like, we should get more people who love Linux and love Linux together. And so we grew the group from 10 people meeting at a Carl's Jr. to about 1,000 people meeting at the local sort of Cisco Executive Briefing Center. They were super generous in setting that up for us. And that turned into doing some work for, I think, Sousa and another, the Gap, I think, at the time. And then those consultancies turned into a job. I was offered a job doing Linux full time and sort of all kinds of stuff for VA Linux. And one of the first things I did at VA Linux was I sponsored Slashdot, because Slashdot had just emerged from Chips and Dips, and I love, and I still count as some of my best friends, Rob Malda and Jeff Bates and the fellas, but they were pretty bad at system management, and they were trying to run it off of a DEC Multia that was ancient. So I sent them some machines I had lying around at the hardware company I was at. And that started our friendship. And then we eventually would merge the companies together. And I worked on VA Linux and Slashdot and SourceForge for 4 years. And then I left and started a game company, and then I went to Google. So that's where my path. And when I got to Google, that's when I got my that last class. And I got my degree, and then I got my master's, because, if you're going to finish your bachelor's, you should get a master's. So, yeah.
So I guess what sort of brought you to California in the first place?
I really didn't like Washington D.C. So I was working for this law firm, and I was running the email network. And honestly, here's the thing about technology jobs that I don't think people say often enough: they're actually really, really fun, right? And there's a real sense of accomplishment of going into an IT environment and cleaning it up and making it tidy and making it tight and work great, And I that always just really, really appealed to me. So I went to this law firm, and they're like, oh, okay, here, go run the email network. And I'm like, okay. And I did a great job, if I do say so myself. And then, I was there for about 9 months, and everything was just running tickety boo. It was just like a machine, which is what it was. And I remember I was like, oh, I wonder who we represent, and it's like that scene in the horror movie where they zoom in and pan out, and it's like, and I was like, oh boy, oh, we're those lawyers, huh? Oh boy, wait, what did I do? What did I help with? And so I was like, oh, this is gonna weigh heavily on me. And in fact, there was a movie at the time based on a John Grisham novel called The Pelican Brief. I don't know if you've all seen it. It was Denzel Washington and the Pretty Woman person. And in the movie, there's an evil law firm, and they actually filmed the evil law firm scenes at our evil law firm. And I was like, you guys didn't put this together that we were the evil law firm? Because we're the evil law firm, that. They're like, no, it's just great that they're taking a movie here. And I'm like, we're the evil law firm, right? Anyway, so my brother-in-law, who was working at Tandem, he's like, hey, do you want to interview to be a tester over here? And I'm like, yeah, tell me all about that, right? So Tandem really just remarkably, they flew me out to California. Yes, thank you, Ronak. I'm sure that's exactly the right one. And they flew me out to California, and I remember I was going to be interviewing for a asynchronous transfer mode networking testing position. And I knew that, they did all their work in C and a bit of C++. That this was a long time ago. So I remember, I loved C. You have to realize that C was mother's milk for me. It was so great. And so I memorized the standard IO and standard lib documentation and the libraries as preparation for the interview. And I ended up in an interview with a guy, and he asked me, because I was a super junior developer, and this was not really a senior developer position. They wanted somebody who would literally like go like this, turn on and off the power to terminals to test the fault tolerance of the machine. And so they're like, so how would you implement string length in C? And so I wrote out string length as it's in the standard IO library. And he's like, is that the implementation from standard IO? And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, you just wrote it down like that? And I was like, yeah, I mean, I was told that I had to know C to do this interview. And he's like, well, you got it. And so they moved me out. They paid me the smallest amount of money humanly possible. Well, I mean, it wasn't minimum wage, but it was pretty close. It was not a lot of money. And you know, it was a great job. It was wonderful. I tested. So the ATM job didn't exist. So they're like, no, you're just gonna be a normal tester. I'm like, great. And so we set up test harnesses and configured machines, and we had these new versions of the operating system we were testing. And it was honestly, it was a terrific job. It was a great first job in the Valley. And then I switched over when they found out that I had learned about cryptography when I was at the State Department. They put me on one of their certificate authority teams, and that was super fun. And yeah, it was a great first job in the Valley. So yeah.
And earlier you mentioned that like you started a game company. I guess one of the questions from our audience is what was that game company and what was the game?
So here's the thing. I haven't just started one game company, because the one that I started after VA Linux, it didn't do well and we shut it down. So it's lost in the dustbin of history. It's the sands of time. But about 5 years ago, the fella who started the game company with me 20 or so years ago is this incredibly brilliant developer who I recruited at Google actually shortly after I got here. He's like, Chris, we have to do a game again. And I was like, Sam, no. And he's like, yes, we have to. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I asked our legal representatives here, and because I work with them very, very closely, because I work on intellectual property issues throughout Google all the time. And I was like, listen, so me and Sam, we're going to do a game. What do you think? And they're like, okay, yeah, that's fine. And we created some ground rules on how to keep Google out of it and keep the game company separate. So that's been going for about 5 years, and we're finally hitting closed alpha. But I shouldn't talk too much about that. It's linked for my Twitter profile, but you're talking to the guy from Google, so I don't want to cross the streams here. But game development is, so I will say, if you want to get into game development, Google has a group called Stadia. And I know that people are like, oh yeah, I've heard about the streaming and stuff. But they have their own game division where they're working on first party and third party games. But yeah, the game business is really fun. It's a great place to start a career in computer science. There's always a lot of really exciting things going on. There's a person named Grant Schonkweiler, okay, Shonkweiller. And if you Google for him or you look him up on YouTube, you'll find a number of like how to get into the game business and what do game developers really do and that kind of thing. And he's a really genuinely great person. He really wants to bring more people. Oh, look, Ronak found something, huh? He really wants to bring people into the games business, and he's super neat. So I totally recommend going and looking at his videos and his talks from GDC if you're interested in games, because I find him inspiring. So
So I guess next we're in transition to like your time at Google and stuff. And so what role does open source play at Google in terms of like the company's larger technical goals? And
Sure.
also one of the questions from our audience is like, how does Google encourage open source through that?
Sure. So the open source is pretty fundamental at Google. And what I mean by that is we use so much of it, right? And one of the things I sort of took as my sort of personal mission at the company was to make sure that Googlers didn't have any barriers to either using or releasing open source projects at the company. So currently we're sitting at about 2,700 30-day active open source projects in the company. And what I mean by that is those are the ones that are external. We use actually quite a bit more, but it's like the same amount of lines of code. But anyway, long and short of it is those are the projects that are external to the company that have seen activity in the last 30 days. So we see ourselves as extremely efficient bureaucrats, right? Which I know is what every computer scientist wants to hear. But it's actually really, really satisfying that when a Googler wants to send a patch out, they don't even have to ask permission if it's just like under a proper open source license on GitHub. They're already granted permission just from the second they start at Google to do that. As far as like larger projects, like when you have the Chromiums or the Androids or the Kubernetes or the Go's, usually what'll happen with that is someone prominent, like a Rob Pike or something, will want to do something truly interesting and unique, and they want to do it as open source. So this is how it was with Fuchsia too. It's like from the very first patch, Fuchsia was open source, very first CL. And our work then is it's a little different. We try to help them understand what's the right license to choose based on the kinds of developers they want to work with. Like when Angular came out, it's like obviously they're going to use a JavaScript friendly license. Yeah, when people want to do work in the Linux kernel, they're going to use the GPL. So we just try to help people find their developers and their developer communities. And then there are times when people want to go even further and they want to actually externalize operations, everything from putting minutes online to joining foundations to donating code to foundations, like we recently did with AMP. Which was the Accelerated Mobile Pages project at Google. So, we sort of have a very broad remit, which is good and bad, because sometimes people think that we're not there to help them when we absolutely are. We try to help people from the very moment they start. We do Noogler, which is the new Googler trainings, to tell people how to do open source, and we're constantly meeting with engineering and product leadership so they understand what open source can do for them and what they can do for open source, and vice versa there. So yeah, I don't know if I actually answered your whole question, because I'm not great with multi-part questions, so it's okay to say no, but you didn't answer this one, so just
No, I think that was good. And one of the other things that someone in the audience asked was, what would you say Google's most important contribution to open source has been over the past decade? Sort of branching off of what you guys are doing.
Oh boy. So if you had asked me a couple of years ago, I would have said it was Go, because there's some releases that I go, oh boy. And Android is more than 10 years old now, so I got the decade to clear out. So I'd say from a computer science perspective and industry perspective, Go is probably the highest impact project that we've released in the last 10 years. Although it kind of released in 2008 too. So I guess TensorFlow then, right? So TensorFlow is a very opinionated release from Google, where we were like, listen, you need to pay attention to neural networks again. These are not the neural networks of the 80s and 90s. And so when we came out with TensorFlow, we were putting a flag in the ground and saying, hey, this is super, super important for you to take seriously again. And so I've been probably TensorFlow in the last 10 years. I love all of my projects, all my big projects, all my small projects. So Kubernetes is super important. Istio is super important, But yeah, it's like, if I were going to look at what's going to happen, I'd say pay close attention to Go, pay close attention to TensorFlow. As computer scientists, I think you'll find that those two things are probably going to be long lasting in ways that even, the thing is, there are projects that are strategically extremely important, like Android and Chromium. And then things like Kubernetes. I mean, if it wasn't for Kubernetes, we wouldn't have a competitive cloud market, But from a computer science perspective, Go. Go, I don't know if you know this. I don't know if not a lot of people, well, I guess a lot of people use TikTok. If you look at the base, well, not of TikTok, but of all the Shenzhen based services from Tencent and from Alibaba and the rest, basically Shenzhen is a Go town. Like, all those backends were written in Go. I mean, it's kind of amazing. Like, the entire of the Chinese technology industry backend, it's all Go. 201. And it's like, I couldn't have called that. This is like kind of amazed by it all. Right. It's kind of amazing where it's showed up. And I'm really proud of the team, you know.
So Go is obviously one of the like major successes you guys have had, but well, what are some of like the biggest obstacles open source at Google has had? Like, how are you able to overcome them?
You know, there's off. So here's the thing: Google is kind of a big company, right? So people will sometimes see our releases through the lens of being afraid of Google, which I think is always a shame, but it is part of being very, very large. So so that sort of psychic weight can be pretty draining and a pretty big obstacle. Like, you know, a good example of that actually is accelerated mobile pages. People are like, oh, AMP is just about Google stealing page views from newspapers. And I'm like, it's actually, no, we're trying to create better experiences on mobile phones for newspapers and the rest. And a lot of people agree and have adopted these extensions, but you know, it saddens me when people are like, no, AMP is just Google trying to kill off, you know, this paper, that paper. I'm like, that is not the case. It's just, you know, some of the default installations of content management systems, they'll have your phone download, you know, a 1/4 gigabyte of data to show a page. And it's like, no, can we gotta pare down. So we had this thing called it was like Faster Web or something. It was just it was an effort under a fella. He ended up going to Facebook, I think, actually, Steve did. And their goal was to basically make it so the web wasn't so thick and messy, you know, so that you could load it into a cell phone. You could load it into these devices that were more limited. And it was a great project, you know, and we came, that's what, so I don't know if you know, but Google hosts all common JavaScript libraries in our caches. And so people are like, oh, you're just doing that so you can track people. It's like, no, we don't log that stuff. We don't track it. It's just there to make the web faster, right? So if you load from your JavaScript libraries from RCDN, you know it's going to be right there next to, you know, some YouTube video, you know, that we're trying to push it to the edge across what we call the Band-Aid network. And it's one of our caching networks at the company. And it's because we want people to continue to like the internet and the web and not just go to apps for everything, right? So anyway.
Yeah, so another big part of open source at Google is the Google Summer of Code program.
Mm-hmm.
So could you talk to us a little bit about that and like why students should take part in it?
And your students. So this is perfect. So the Summer of Code is basically targeted at university students. Usually we see freshman summer and sophomore summer students take part. And what it is we pair you up, or you pair yourself up with a mentor from the open source software development community. So we pick like 100 orgs, and we've been working with them for 16 years in some cases. And our goal is to introduce new people to both these open source orgs, and introduce the world of open source to you students, right? So one of the things that stuck with me from my college days is that sometimes universities are really, really good at teaching how to program, how algorithms work, how you time things out, right? But they're really bad at giving you real world exposure to problems, right? And it's okay. I mean, it's okay for the universities to be more academic, right? Because that's the nature. But if we can expose you to the real world of computer science and what it really means to serve users and other developers, I think it's really good for the computer scientist in how they develop. So you can sort of have an eye. It's like, oh, okay, my code will run like this in this manner. Is that really what I wanted, or did I want to do this? And I think it's a really great program. And I will say also, you know, I think it's really important for people to do over the summer before they go off and intern at, you know, Google or TikTok or whatever. And, you know, it can be really super. So it's a great learning experience.
And you said earlier, if you for us not to be like you in terms of students, but if you were a student today, what
Mhm.
would you focus on in order to be as helpful as possible to open source projects outside of Google Summer of Code?
That's a really good question. I would, it's no different the advice I would give an early self than I would give any of you. Find a project that you're really interested in. Find some aspect of computer science or the internet that you find just fascinating and interesting, or find a frustrating problem that you want to fix and just really annoys you whenever you go to do it. And that's where you'll find the open source project that you'll be most happiest in. So when I was in school, the web was just emerging, right? And I remember sitting in the back of I think it was like my compilers class or my algorithms class, and a friend of mine and we were messing around with a very early version of the Apache web server, and I was trying to get a domain out of PSINet, which became MCI, which became VeriSign or whatever. And it was just so much fun. And it's like, I wish back then, which was about a year or two before I had moved to California and about a year or two before I had joined VA Linux, I wish I had just dug into Apache back then, because that would have been so much fun. But I would end up going and meeting those people, and that was great too. So I don't have any regrets here. But find the thing that just is so engaging for you that you can't not do it. And I bet you there's an open source project just waiting for you. So
And I think another thing a lot of people are wondering about is like thinking about yourself and the various people you've been around in the tech world, like the characteristics they have. What sort of characteristics stand out to you as indicators of like successful open source contributors and innovators?
Well, I mean, so this is one of those things where I don't think that there's a qualifier of open source uh, involved. When people are successful in computer science in the computer industry, it's because they're able to take what is sometimes hard won knowledge of how computers can and should and do work, and turn it into code, turn it into executable code. Because there's a lot of folks who, um, either by dint of luck or whatever, don't get a chance to work on computers for a living. And I just think that it's the best living you can make, being able to use a keyboard and make computers do what you want to do, and creating really great experiences for people with through programming, through computer science. I just think it's an incredible privilege. So I know this isn't actually your question, but it's like the characteristics for me are that people really enjoy programming. They enjoy making computers dance, right? And more commonly and lately, not so much when I was in school, and you get along with people who are like that, you know. So when I was growing up in computer science, there frankly wasn't a lot of us, and so it was more isolationist, I guess is one word of thinking about it. But nowadays it seems like there's a lot more teams, there's a lot more people, and that's kind of great, so you should be able to find your cohort, find your people, as my wife likes to say, and do stuff with them, and that can be really super fun. So
And another thing that
but
audience
not
is
in person
asking,
because of COVID. So just
fair enough. Another thing that the audience is asking is like if you're trying to like start a company, how did you start yours, and do you have any advice for entrepreneur types that are considering a similar path down the road?
So I have to tell you, it's funny because the first time we started the game company after VA Linux, it was so expensive to do the most basic things. One of the great things about open source software and actually the cloud and all these things is it has never been less expensive than this very moment to start a company, to run a company online. It's almost like you have to try to spend money on infrastructure and the rest. So it comes down to, do you have the time, right? The amount of throw weight that a talented programmer has because of the installed base of open source software and servers and free cloud tiers and all the rest is just huge. There's It's such a productive environment, if you're able to marshal these resources together, you actually have to try to spend money unwisely, so, and there's plenty of people who will tell you have to spend money with them, but I will tell you that come up with that which you want to work on, and I bet you could find a path where it's something you can do for very little money or for fun until you find out if it's actually a real thing beyond that. So
One of the other questions we have from the audience is, how does Google decide a direction for their future and current open source projects? And how can that sort of apply to students who are looking to work on their own open source projects?
Well, it depends on the area. So like when you look at something like Android or Chromium, they have users and they keep an eye on what they want and need, and they try to tack into those wins, right? And then you have something like cloud where we have customers and we're trying to sell services on top of open source software, right? So the thing is, this isn't actually an open source question. This is how do you run a company or a product or a customer engagement model? And I'm not coming down on it. It's just, these questions then feed into, well, what do we want out of releasing a given project or working on a given released project and keeping it going? So yeah, decision making inside companies is always completely wacky, right? And I don't mean that in a denigrating way. It's just every time. So I've worked in very, very large companies and very, very small companies, right? So working for a very, very small startup, and then working for Google, working for the US government, working for, medium-sized companies that are 500-600 people, they're all insanely different from each other in how decisions are made. And because there's often hierarchies, and it's funny because I think Valve has that whole, we have no hierarchies. And what that means is they have hierarchies, they're just not telling you, right? It's like people still make decisions. People still have to make decisions. And then resources are applied to those directions. And so I would just say, wherever you end up interning or going to work, try to figure out who is actually making decisions. And if you want to be one of those people, how they got there and all the rest. So there was a period of time when my daughter, who's now in college, this was a long time ago, I think it was 7th grade or 8th grade, she's like, I want to be a forest ranger. And I was like, huh, okay. So we went, this is maybe an indication of how much of a dork I am. We went on to LinkedIn and we said, well, let's look up all the forest rangers we can find and see what their backgrounds are, right? And so I'm like, so, okay, well, do you want to study criminal justice? Do you want to study, like there was a lot of law enforcement degrees and law enforcement backgrounds for rangers, because rangers are actually a form of police, it turns out. And then they also would have the University of Bemidji, Minnesota, because they have a really good ranger program that works with the local First Peoples tribes. And it's like, so is this what you thought it was? Is this, what you want? And she ended up not wanting that, but she was in 7th grade. It's okay. She can change her mind. But yeah, so yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, but long and short of it is, if you find out who makes decisions and you actually want to be that person as opposed to being somebody who executes for these people, it's worth looking into how people got to where they got to, right? And see if that's something that you want, right?
And getting back to like the open source aspect of it, one of the concerns that arises in the argument between open source software versus commercial software is that commercial software tends to be easier to use because there's the customer support and all that stuff that comes with the shipped software. So how would you address this at Google, and are you guys doing anything to make it easier to use?
So yes and no. The thing about, again, this isn't just about open source software. There's plenty of commercial software that is hugely poorly supported. So the nice thing about open source software is if you're an adopter of it, if you're a user of it, you can dig in to whatever amount you can afford in terms of engineer time if something goes wrong, right? So the question then becomes, well, I can't afford a lot of engineer time. Who do I pay for support? Well, it turns out most projects that are that important have some form of paid support model, either given by the team itself or by some startup or by a large company like IBM, Red Hat, Google, whatever, right? So yeah, so there's this discussion of, well, what does the right commercial support model look like? And we can talk about that until we're blue in the face. But long and short of it is, this is actually not a problem for open source. It's just a problem in software. So, because I've worked in enough places and I've seen enough commercial software to realize that just being open source or proprietary doesn't mean you will get bad or good service. It comes down to how you manage that relationship with that vendor, creator, software development team, or your own internal engagement team, because it can be very, very good or it can be very, very bad, and it's independent of the license. So yeah.
And part of your advocacy for open source, you were actually in a movie about open source titled Revolution OS.
Oh yeah, that was
and you even played a role on the crew of the TV show Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
So what were those experiences like? And did you view them as sort of helpful ways to spread support for open source software?
Now, so Revolution OS was basically, it was about the early days of the Linux movement and the Linux user groups and VA Linux and all these things. And it was a fun little documentary, but it wasn't, like revolutionary documentary that everyone thinks about, it was fun to be in it. Same thing with Silicon Valley. There was a period of sort of maximum, I don't know, crankiness on my part, and I ran into the developers of Silicon Valley. They came out to the Google campus before they started filming season 1, and I was unable to make the meeting, so whatever. And then when they came back out for season 2 and they wanted a tour of Google X and the rest, they were sort of given the, very corporate presentation. And they went from us to Twitter, and they were talking to the head of Twitter's comms unit at the time, Karen Wickery, who's an old friend. And they're like, yeah, we were just at Google. It was super weird. She's like, well, who did you talk to? And they mentioned who they, she's like, oh, you should talk to Chris. So they came down, and the head producer, John, and his like set people were there, and they're like, we want to get an idea of what it really looks like to program inside a large company and a small company and startups, and any color you can give us. Karen said that you knew stuff. I'm like, yeah, okay. So I took them around Google X, I took them around Google, but then I did this big tour of the Valley where I basically drove around. I said, okay, here's where this happened, here's where that happened. And then I got them together with these, kind of older Unixy people, and said, these are the people, like that guy there, he's the person who ran the internet's root servers for a decade as the web was growing, and that's the person who, when they built the fiber ring in Palo Alto, they terminated it at his shop because he provides bandwidth for all the people in Palo Alto. And they're like, oh, can we see that? I'm like, sure. So we go over to his place. Anyway, long and short of it was Silicon Valley. I really like Mike Judge. I think he's just a brilliant, filmmaker and television maker. And he's actually a genuinely kind of sweet man, and so I would talk to him and Alec Berg just a couple of times, and it was just fun to help out. And then, so my daughter was going to this girls' school in Palo Alto, and I was getting exposed to a lot of the very Silicon Valley TV show type experiences. And so I would just call up John, and I would call up the production and be like, oh my God, I have to say what I just saw. And so we would just have a great time telling stories, and that would turn into sometimes plots and the rest. And so second and third season of Silicon Valley, I mean, myself and one of my coworkers, Dan ended up writing a lot of the legal language in the show that was used during the intellectual property discussions. So I don't want to like overdo the time here. So we got 11 minutes. So I can tell a story. I give this Noogler training at Google, and I talk about intellectual property and how if you want to have something be yours, you need to do it on your own hardware and your own, time and all that. And after the talk, this guy comes up to me. He's like, listen, I got to tell you, you're completely wrong about what you said. And I was like, oh, pray tell, And he's like, well, I've been watching Silicon Valley, on HBO. And I'm like, yeah, I'm familiar with the show. He's like, no, the TV show, not the area, the TV show. And I'm like, yeah, I'm familiar with it. He's like, yeah, but they had this whole storyline about people having code written at, but not written at the company, but on their own equipment, but not their own equipment. And you're completely wrong. And I'm literally standing there next to the guy who wrote all the segments and made sure that it was all right. And he wrote both sides, the lawyer, the arbitrator, I mean, everything. And I'm just like, hey, Dan, I think he wants to talk to you. And the guy's like, yeah, because I was watching Silicon Valley, the TV show. And I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty familiar with it. And so I brought up my IMDb page and I brought up the senior technical consultants, and there's me and Dan Berlin. Our names are right up there. And I was like, this one. He's like, yeah, Silicon Valley. And I'm like, yeah, Silicon Valley. And he's like, oh, so you've seen it. I'm like, dude, come on. He wrote that stuff. We know what we're talking about. We're not trying to steer you wrong. We're trying to help, but it was just really silly. So yeah. The point I'm trying to make though is, as I've done more and more open source, and as I've done more and more open source for Google, I actually see getting these stories out there, giving speeches to ACM groups at UCSD. I see it as actually an important part of maintaining compliance at Google, because if I can train people before they ever show up at Google, when they get to Google, they're ready to go. When I release software that people train up on and learn about, when they get to Google, they're like, oh, it's Go. I know this. I can do this. Right. And it saves a huge amount of time. It's good for people's careers. And it keeps me calm and patient and happy. And also, I just love science fiction. So it's why I helped out with things like Devs, and why I've helped out with a couple different productions, because it's a blast. It's like when Good Omens, they're like, hey, Chris, we need some help navigating Google Maps and using Google Maps and for our special effects group. Can you help? And I'm like, of course, because who doesn't want to help out, with some movie or some TV show, because it's super fun. So that's it. And my goal is to be like a dead body in the background of some of these, Canadian science fiction shows. I don't want much. You don't want me talking before a camera. I'm not good looking like that. So, but it's fun to help out.
And just a fun fact for everyone in the audience: actually, Mike Judge went to UCSD. So
that's
yeah,
right.
But that's beside the point. Anyways, from your perspective, one of the questions in the audience, is there anything that you think Google can do more of to support open source?
Sure. Yeah. But I mean, so listen, we can always do more. We could always do less, but we could always do more. Right. So one of the things that we try to do in our group is we try to figure out how we can make it easier and easier for Googlers to, by default, help out open source projects, because I see it as not just good for open source, but I really see Google being part and parcel of open source. I mean, we're literally in every project. We did 177,000 patches on GitHub last year as Googlers. So it's like, we're everywhere. I want us to be everywhere in open source software, because it makes it better for us and for computer science, but it really makes it easier for us to just do what we do, So yeah, I'm a huge fan of open sourcing a ton of stuff,
And there's just a few more audience questions I wanted to get to before
Sure.
we end. One of them is just what has been your favorite city to work in?
Oh, wow. Boy, so it's funny. I sometimes have, city fathers and country folks say, so how can I make Silicon Valley work in my country? And I say to them, okay, here's what you do, right? You have a big research university, then you take away anything good culturally, make literally just movie theaters the only thing you got, put in some half-ass restaurants, and make it so that nobody ever really wants to go outside because there's not much to do. So they go, that sounds terrible. And I'm like, yeah, welcome to Mountain View. Now, it's got a lot better over the years, right? We have much nicer restaurants than we did 10 years ago. And San Francisco's okay culturally, but honestly, I think that I'm going to probably end up in London or maybe New York full time at some point. I spent a lot of time in London, at least I did before COVID, and I love that town. It's so much fun. It's so neat. And so, we try to get there. Well, in the past, I was going there about 4 times a year. But yeah, San Diego's nice. You've got that whole gas works area. I don't remember what they call it with the torch lights and
Yeah.
Gas lamp district, and that's a pretty neat area. You're better than Irvine. Sorry, that's mean. I think San Diego's. You're close to Mexico. You're close to Los Angeles. You have a lot of good things going for you. I live in Irvine. Oh, I'm sorry, Sam. Irvine was okay. The university was actually pretty nice. It was a little dull. Yeah, I don't know what favorite city. There's no such thing. I mean, every city has so many great things about them. Like even Sacramento. I could tell you some great things about Sacramento, right? Or Fresno. I bet you there's probably something good about Stockton, even. So can you? Yeah, I mean, honestly, I have a hard time hating on cities, even though it's fun to tease, because people just trying to get by. Sacramento is a little boring, but it's their boring, right? So spend less traffic time there than you do in Los Angeles. Yeah, but yeah, I love Los Angeles. Yeah, what's the next question? Sorry, you don't need to hear me hammer about cities.
Someone asked if now that there's the option to live remotely, do you think there's going to be a mass exodus out of the Bay Area?
Yes and no. So one of the things that we found is that the people who thrive on remote work are generally more senior, and people whose frankly children are a little older. People who are younger and new to the business, they seem to do a lot better on site. So I don't think it's going to lead to an emptying of the cities, but I think we have to rethink how we do our campuses and how we welcome people into our company, right? Because it's not an option to just say, well, we're not going to hire any junior employees anymore. It's not a thing. So we have to figure out how to balance people in the beginning and middle of their career, as well as at the end, for productivity. And so I don't think it's going to end up emptying out the Bay Area. I hope it makes it a little cheaper, because cost of living in the Bay Area is insane. And it's really hostile to young people, honestly, when it's this expensive. It's funny because my daughter's boyfriend, he was an intern at Facebook, and he was rooming with like 3 other interns. And I've known people who, in their first years at Google or at Facebook or at Apple, and they're rooming with like 1 million people. And I'm like, that can't be good for you mentally. It's like, I know you all are crammed into dorms as a matter of course, but at some point you want to have your own place, right? Anyway, so yeah, that's my answer to that, I guess.
Awesome. And just to sort of wrap it up, I think the last question we have is, what are your favorite open source projects, or the coolest ones you know of?
Oh boy. So it depends on the week. Right now it's sort of bouncing between TensorFlow and PyTorch, because you can just have a lot of fun with that. It's funny, there's a little library in Python called NLTK that it's just so much fun to use. So I've been messing around with tying together Discord and some NLTK bot stuff that I've been doing, and it's just been super fun. And this is not for work; this is for a blast, right? And it's kind of fun. So I don't know. That's kind of my favorites right now. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for coming to talk with us. I think
Thanks for
we're
having me.
just about out of time.
Yep.
So yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks, Chris, for taking the time to meet with us.
Thanks for being members of the ACM. I know that the ACM really appreciates y'all.
Yeah.
So keep
and Innovate's really trying to grow to get that sort of entrepreneurship community going at SD. But
sure.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. Goodbye, everybody.
All right, I'm gonna end the thing now.
All right, I think we're solid.
All right.
Be awesome.
Well,